You're listening to Drug Positive, the risk reduction and benefit enhancement podcast, reducing shame and stigma to save lives and end the drug war. Hi everyone, Emmanuel here on a cold, crisp morning in the high desert of Santa Fe, New Mexico. You know, I moved here in March, and man, do I love it. The dry air, crazy cacti, and my favorite new thing that I'm going to tell you about, arroyos. In case you've never seen them, an arroyo is a unique feature to mountainous desert. Essentially, it's a dry riverbed, usually pretty deep and narrow, carved out by rain and snowmelt that flows down from the mountains. They're usually empty and you can walk in them, but here's the thing. You got to watch out for flash floods because a storm even miles away that you can't see could cause a wall of water to suddenly appear out of nowhere and crush you to death, because it's usually carrying with it logs and other debris it picked up in the mountains. Look it up on YouTube, arroyos and flash floods. Super cool. Another thing I love about New Mexico is that it's really psychedelic oriented. Psychedelics seem deeply ingrained in the local culture here. And I'm not talking about Meow Wolf, Santa Fe's immersive psychedelic art experience museum thingy. You should definitely go to it if you haven't already. And, you know, it's funny, Meow Wolf doesn't use the word psychedelic anywhere in their marketing, even though it's so obviously psychedelic drug induced. It's probably because you can't really say the word psychedelic these days when you're trying to get parents to bring their children in. You got to be subversive about it. Indoctrinate the kids into psychedelic culture without the grown-ups figuring it out. You know what I mean? It's been going on since the 60s, right? The psychedelic subversion. I mean, think about it. Our culture is totally psychedelic. I saw an IBM Cloud commercial the other day, totally filled with psychedelic imagery, undeniably psychedelic. And it's everywhere today. I mean, when Steve Jobs says LSD inspired him, and when you just look around at the art and music of our culture, it's obvious. Our entire culture is constantly telling children, use drugs. When you grow up, take psychedelics. Then you too will make art like this. But because of the drug war, everyone still pretends that that's not happening. No, drugs have nothing to do with this. These melting clocks you see here in this insurance commercial, just because, you know, melting clocks and insurance, right? But actually, this is starting to change. Lots of artists nowadays and musicians are acknowledging the role that psychedelics played in their art. The politics is changing, and that's great. There really is a psychedelic renaissance happening. And of course, I do want to say a lot of artists do come up with amazing psychedelic art who have never taken psychedelics. And this isn't just because they've been influenced by artists around them who have taken psychedelics. It's also because psychedelics simply reveal to us what's already inside of us. They don't add anything new that wasn't already there. Sasha always used to say this. When you smell a fragrance, it brings up memories of the times you've smelled that fragrance before. The memories aren't contained in the fragrance, right? And the same goes for psychedelics. The one exception, though, may be DMT, which we talk about during the interview coming up. DMT is different. It's perhaps the only psychedelic that opens up an entirely new world of experience, something completely alien, something with actual aliens even. You meet elf creatures that speak to you. Not everyone, but most. I did. You'll hear a little bit about it. Anyway, but you got to do a large enough dose to cross over into this other world. None of this light DMT vape pen stuff that's becoming popular at tipper shows, people. That's not going to do it. If you want to meet the alien machine elves, you got to do a breakthrough dose. And don't worry, because despite what you hear in this episode, the likelihood of these aliens cutting you open to examine your organs is extremely low. For the most part, they're benevolent little creatures that shower you with love. And I love what Terence McKenna says about this. They shower you with love, but it's love that's spelled L-U-V because they're motherfucking trickster elves. And you'll know what I mean if you've ever broken through on DMT before. 3 big hits of smoke, people, from a glass pipe. That'll do it. Much, much harder with a vape pen. Anyway, where was I? Oh, New Mexico. Yeah. So the culture here is psychedelic, and I'm not talking about Meow Wolf. I'm talking about the indigenous roots of this place. New Mexicans like to say that New Mexico is neither new nor Mexico. Santa Fe is actually older than the United States. The conquistadors came here, when was it? The 1500s. And they met the Pueblos. And, of course, they killed a lot of them and settled here. But lots of the indigenous people survived. And they're still here, too. So when you meet locals here, a lot of times their heritage goes back like 400 years. They're either descendants of the Spanish conquistadors or they're Native Americans, native New Mexicans. And psychedelic cacti have been a part of this landscape for thousands of years. Mescaline, peyote, San Pedro. People sell them at the farmer's market in Santa Fe. Most locals you talk to here have some sort of experience with psilocybin or mescaline. It's kind of integrated into the original root culture here more than any other place I've lived. That's what I mean by New Mexico's psychedelic culture. And I love it. I'm glad I'm here. And today, I interview a direct descendant of New Mexican culture. Mitchell Gomez, the current executive director of DanceSafe. Mitchell lives in Denver, but he has roots here that go way back. And Mitchell's one of my favorite people in the world, not just because he's leading the organization I founded. I love Mitchell because he's talented, smart, funny, committed to drug policy reform. And did I say smart? Mitchell is one of the smartest people I know. He's so smart, in fact, that I didn't even bother to come up with a topic for this episode. I usually try to pick a topic to focus on, give an opening monologue about it, give the episode a provocative title about the topic, and then interview someone solely about that topic. But Mitchell knows so much stuff, especially about drugs, that I just didn't want to restrict him. I thought, let me just interview him and see what comes up. And it was the right decision, which you're soon going to find out. And just so you know, Mitchell didn't know I was going to interview him. He knew he was going to be on the podcast, but he thought we were just going to be talking for about 10 minutes about Ben Westhoff's book, the journalist I interviewed in the previous episode. So this is kind of a spontaneous conversation, something new I haven't done before. But it worked out great. And it's probably one of my favorite episodes so far. We talk about a ton of stuff. Everything from DMT Elves to what's going on these days with DanceSafe to the state of harm reduction. We even talk about whether we're living in an AI simulation. You're going to love it. So here he is, no more ranting, the current executive director of DanceSafe, one of the smartest people I know, and the only person I know to have ever done a thumbprint of LSD. Let's hear it for Mitchell Gomez. Thank you for being on the show. It's so great to interview you.
Yeah, really happy to be here.
Yeah, and I know this is kind of a surprise for you. Tell listeners now, Mitchell thought he was going to be on this show sort of as a co-host for the last episode with Ben Westhoff. But I wanted to just interview Mitchell for a full-on episode. So that's what we're doing right now. So he didn't really prepare for this. And I really want to go deep with him, Mitchell, because, I love that you're the DanceSafe executive director. I think you're the best executive director we've ever had, even better than me. And I have not had enough time to just kind of get to know you as a person, really. We haven't spent that much time together, Burning Man a few times, whatever. But, I want to use this opportunity to really get to know you on a personal level. So I'm going to ask you some really difficult, challenging questions. And the audience will get to know, who is Mitchell Gomez? Are you okay with that?
Yeah, for sure. And it's really touching that you say that as well. Man. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, so you don't know the opening that I've recorded introducing you, and so you might be a little surprised by my first question, but you are the only person I know who's done this, and I want to ask you, what is it like doing a thumbprint of LSD?
Yeah, I mean, super high doses of LSD, I personally don't find to be nearly as interesting as some other substances I've done because a lot of it is just sort of a whiteout,
Huh.
right? Like, I know that, like, I was there, I was doing things because, like, my little flashes of memory are, like, I'm not, like, strapped to a bed, right? Like, I'm up, I'm moving, I was clearly eating, I was clearly, like, doing things.
Did you have a sitter? Was anyone with you?
No, this was an accidental ingestion of high dose LSD. This was not an intentional.
Oh, you didn't actually describe to people what a thumbprint is.
Yeah, so a thumbprint of LSD is when you stick your thumb into a thing of crystal and lick it. For years and years and years, it was used as a sort of initiation to certain circles of LSD dealers. I think the theory being that no undercover officer could possibly maintain their cover after taking like a few milligrams, not micrograms, right? A few milligrams of LSD.
Yeah, right. Well, I'm actually happy to know you didn't do this intentionally, but how the heck did it happen accidentally?
Yeah, a mislabeled water bottle. So every capful of the water bottle was a dose of LSD. It was an easy way to gift it out, right?
Oh.
This was in Portugal. This was shortly after they had decriminalized all drugs. This was actually 2002, and so the police had not yet quite figured out what decriminalization was going to look like, and so they were just sort of leaving everything alone.
Uh-huh.
And it was at a very, very, very large music festival, and somebody was using this water bottle to gift it out. And accidentally drank something like 2/3 of a water bottle.
Well, this is a harm reduction lesson. Like, you shouldn't dose LSD that way because accidents like this can happen, right?
Right, or just like really clearly label your bottle. The bottle did have a black X on it.
Mitchell, don't you know not to drink bottles of water with a black X on it?
Well, so part of the problem was that I was not sober when this started, right?
Yes.
And so, which is in some ways is a good thing, right? Because drinking, call it 13 milligrams of acid, when you're completely sober, I think might actually have been a much more difficult experience.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, what happened? That's what I.
Yeah. So I was at Boom on a dance floor. There was a guy who I had spent quite a bit of time with that week. We were camped next to each other. We randomly saw each other, and I asked him if he had some water because I was out. I was like in the middle of the dance floor, and the water spigots. I don't know how Boom is set up now. This was 17 years ago. Is that right? Oh my God.
You were just a kid.
Yeah, I was very young. I was 19 or 20. And there was so the dance floor was set up in the middle, and then there was like water spigots around the edge. So I asked him if he had some water I could have, and I was just going to go refill it after I drank some of his water. He said, yeah, there's some in my bag over there. And I walked over, and there was a water bottle sort of sticking out of the side of his, like the side pocket of his backpack, fairly large, like the sort of European 1 liter water bottles. And so I'm chugging the water bottle. He runs up and grabs my hand as I'm chugging this water. And he screams in my ear. The music is obviously just like thundering psytrance. He screams in my ear, does that bottle have an X on it?
Oh my God.
And I like turn it to the side, and I see this like large black X on the side of the water bottle. And this is actually a very coherent memory of the experience. It's actually my clearest memory of the experience because things hadn't started yet. And he just has this like low laugh. And he goes, I hope you love LSD.
Oh my God.
It wasn't until 3 or 4 days later, he had done the math on what he had gifted out and what he had left, that he figured out that was like roughly the number I had drank.
So it was mostly a whiteout experience?
Yeah, it was. I don't have a lot of coherent memories of the experience.
Huh.
I have little flashes of memory. I have one little flash of memory where I was like clearly standing on a bar spinning poi. I mean, I think I was generally making a bit of an ass of myself. I have another memory of like being chest deep in the lake that's on the property. So there's like a lake on that property, and I remember being like in the water.
Oh, don't go into a lake when you're on.
No, definitely not. I did not make any decision to go into the lake. I just came out of the white fog, and I was chest deep in the water. And there was actually somebody next to me in the water. And I said, are we in a lake? And the guy looks at me, and he like looks down at the water, and he looks back at me, and he looks down at the water, and he goes, I think so. And I just remember thinking like, this guy is no help at all.
God, I have a hard time tying my shoes on 200 mics of LSD.
Yeah, so I've intentionally taken a 1200 mic dose before, which is, the band 1200 mics. I don't know if you know, this is a band name. So the reason they call themselves 1200 mics is that there was this idea that like that's roughly where LSD plateaus. Like it doesn't really get more intense than that. It just gets longer than that.
You only have so many serotonin
2A
receptors,
right? Yeah, exactly.
Well, so you tell me, was your 1200 the same as your thumbprint?
No, because I remember most of it.
Yeah.
So that's all that really happened, is that it got like as intense as it gets, and then it just like my memories stopped encoding. Like I think
interesting.
I think I was actually fairly functional. I mean, I was at that point in my life, I was using LSD relatively often. I was using relatively high doses relatively often, and so I think that was part of it, is that like I was able to just sort of like do the things I was normally doing while I was tripping. I definitely showered at some point.
Was there a recovery period?
Oh yeah, I mean, I felt miserable afterwards.
For how long?
I mean, weeks.
Oh, really? Weeks? Wow.
Yeah, and I actually had a little bit of my only experience with what was clearly HPPD. Like after the drug had left my system, I was still getting like little wavy lines when I would look at particularly printed words, like when I was trying to read a book, like things were like a little bit wavy. And that went on for 2 or 3 weeks.
HPPD, for people, maybe describe it.
Yeah, so HPPD is a hallucinogenic perceptual persistence disorder. It's a pretty poorly understood phenomenon that sometimes happens, that some people ascribe to LSD use. Some people think that it's a pre-existing thing that's triggered by psychedelic use, but it's basically just like the continuation of what you would consider classic like psychedelic visuals.
I've heard there is a certain personality type that tends to get it, and they have more anxiety than most people. The researchers I've talked to said they think that that's not a result of HPPD, but that people that are predisposed in certain ways to HPPD, and one of those markers is anxiety, tend to be the people who get it. Very small percentage.
Yeah, and we don't know what percentage because nobody really studies recreational drug use in a sort of coherent and like well-funded way.
Right.
If you want to get money from the government to study drug use, what they really want is like the most extreme problems.
Yeah.
Our drug war research budget is like part of the drug war, right? And so like that's it. Like they want things that will further the narrative of drugs as this like health scourge. And so it's really hard to study non-problematic substance users. And so we just don't know how many people use LSD in this country. So if you don't know how many people use LSD, there's no way to know what percentage of users.
Right. How many people do you think use LSD today? I mean, for sure it's like peaking, LSD is so widely available now.
Yeah, I think probably more people every weekend than used LSD during the entire summer of love.
Right.
I think that's very clear. I mean, if we're including microdosing, it's clearly more than that, right?
Right. So where's the anti-war movement if so many people are using LSD?
I don't think they were ever really connected.
Well, it's a good question. I was just talking to Rick about that. So the question being, is there anything inherent in psychedelics that politicizes people, makes them more anti-imperialist, et cetera?
Yeah. I used to really believe that. I did. I used to really believe that because everyone I knew who was into psychedelics was like that, right? They understood the problems with late stage capitalism. They understood the problems with like our global military empire. They were all really active in those movements. And then I realized that was literally just like my friend group, right? It was just that like those are the people I spend time with. And so those are the people I was also getting high with.
There could be correlation, not causation thing. People that are more rebels tend to be the people who break the law more, who are willing to.
But also I think that's not even necessarily true either, because like, years later, I found out that like all the jocks at my high school would also do acid. They would just do it as their group, right? Like it wasn't like they would ever come hang out with like the weird gothy hippie kids.
Yeah,
like,
what happens to them? What happens to them when they do acid?
Right. So I think that the only thing that I can see that psychedelics sort of universally do is increase creativity. They're non-specific amplifiers of creativity. And they do really seem to do that. They seem to do that pretty reliably. They seem to do that pretty across the board. Everybody who tries them gets a little more creative in their thinking. They get a little more open in their thinking.
Yeah, well, creativity can be, about your thought process. And if you're an intellectual, it can really enhance, expand your ideas, etc. But not everyone's intellectual, right?
Right. And I mean, maybe some of these guys came up with like better football plays, right? Like while they were on acid. There's a story that when LSD was still legal, there was a group of CIA agents who used it to develop more creative bombing patterns for Vietnam.
This is really, really interesting. I read this book on the history of drugs, and it goes all the way back to like indigenous cultures, and many of them actually would use peyote the night before going out into battle.
Sure. Right. And the idea of the berserkers, right? Like the idea that the Norse Vikings were probably taking, large amounts of Amanita muscaria before they would go into battle.
Right.
Low dose psilocybin mushrooms increase visual acuity. So like there is actually like a survival advantage to using mushrooms before you go into battle.
I just love taking psychedelics and then like getting into brawls. It's my favorite thing.
Yeah, sure. Right. Yeah. But see, you're saying that as a joke, but like, let's go ask Joe Rogan, right? Like,
Has he done that? I haven't listened.
I don't know, but like the guy was super into MMA, super into psychedelics. It's not outside the realm of possibility, right?
That's true.
And so,
of course, we know Mike Tyson took 5-MeO, and now he's this big promoter, peace and love, and everything changed his life. You've heard his podcast,
right? But 5-MeO, I don't even think should be called a psychedelic. That drug itself is a whole other question.
Not mind revealing, but what, soul revealing, maybe?
Yeah, and also like there's no you during the experience, right? Like there's not like an individual having the psychedelic experience.
Well,
like
there's no me right now here anyway, or you for that matter, all the time, Mitchell.
Yeah. It's easy to say those words, right?
I get it. I know what you're saying.
Right. It's super easy to say the words. Experiencing it as like a lived reality is like a whole other. I mean, it makes dudes like Mike Tyson say they never want to hit somebody again because like they recognize that we're all the same person and they don't want to hurt it. They don't want to hurt themselves, right?
Right. Exactly.
But 5 is a different question. With LSD, no, I don't really think there's anything about LSD that is inherently political that drives people towards being liberals. I don't think there's anything about it. I think the reason it had that reputation is that Nixon used that. I mean, that was the whole reason they criminalized LSD, right? It was popular with the anti-war movement. And so they couldn't make anti-war protest illegal because we have the First Amendment in this country.
Right.
But they could criminalize the drug that was popular with the anti-war movement and then go in and arrest the leaders and like target people and have this like massive budget to justify spying on them.
Yeah, just like they used heroin and cannabis that way in the black community. I think that's absolutely right.
Exact same thing. And so no, I think that absolutely there were people in the 1960s using LSD who were not a part of the anti-war movement, who were even maybe pro-war. And I think those people were never targeted. They were never outed as LSD users.
Right. But there is this other phenomenon about the historical coincidence of LSD coming out in the decade it did right as the Vietnam War was starting. And that is that there was no period in our history where we had as much PTSD as we did after World War II. We called it shell shock. But basically all these vets came back from the war and they had PTSD. And the way we dealt with it as a culture was to deny it, right? If you look at, and everyone does, and we laugh at it right now, 50s culture with like Father's Knows Best and show tunes and everything happy and total denial of any kind of dark side at all. And the children of these veterans were the flower children of the 60s. And they saw, I think, immediately the disconnect between what their culture was telling them the reality was like and what their home lives were really like, with domestic violence, alcoholism, suicides, etc. And now they get to be teenagers and young adults, and suddenly, you want me to go to another war? You want to do to me what you did to my parents? At the same time that LSD, this non-specific psychic amplifier, hits the scene. And so it was this big awakening, and LSD got associated with this anti-war movement, I think, because of that specific time period.
Yeah, I mean, that's a dynamic I had never really considered, right? I mean, that was sort of generation removed from my experiences. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that's a really interesting idea that it wasn't just the LSD. It was the LSD combined with their upbringing by parents who had like really severe PTSD with no treatment, no acknowledgement,
right?
Like no recognition at all. Yeah, that combination, I could for sure see people being driven pretty hard left.
I think that's kind of similar to what's happening now, really, with the resurgence of psychedelics about 10 years after 9/11. It really kind of started the whole festival thing about 2011-12. And my speculation there is that the age group that was most traumatized during 9/11 were the kids that were between the ages of like 7 and 12. Right? Because if you're 4 or 5, you don't know what's going on. And by the time you're a teenager, you're more interested in your peer group than you are in what's happening in the world, right? But if you're in this critical period, 7 to 11-ish, 9/11 was really fucking traumatizing. I mean, we're being attacked and your parents are freaked out and all that. And when I was first went to LIB in 2013, that was kind of my reintroduction, got back involved in DanceSafe, et cetera. Like, I noticed that everyone at this festival was like in their early 20s at the most. I was like the oldest person there, and I'm like, what's going on here? And I think that in some ways, people are seeking out psychedelics and community around psychedelics as a way to heal from this collective trauma of 9/11. I can't prove that, but I think there might be something there, because we know psychedelics are medicines that can heal trauma, especially MDMA, but I think even LSD and the
sure,
others.
And also like that was the primary drug, right? I mean, the primary drug was not LSD,
right?
The primary drug was MDMA, right? Which is this incredibly healing, incredibly like And like I often say that like the biggest mistake we made was calling it ecstasy. It should never have been called ecstasy. It should have been called empathy.
Sure.
Right? That should have been the name. But I also think there's a different dynamic. I think that the 9/11 connection is one I'd never considered. I was in college when 9/11 happened. And so my first thought when I saw the second plane hit the tower, when I saw the first plane hit the tower, like everyone else, I assumed it was some sort of horrible accident, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when the second plane hit the tower, my immediate first thought was, we're going to invade Iraq for oil.
Yep.
Like, it doesn't matter who did this. Like, it literally doesn't matter who did this. We have the son of the guy who wanted to invade Iraq for oil in the White House. He's incredibly gullible, incredibly easy to manipulate. Like, the war hawks are going to push us back into Iraq. It was my first thought, and it was absolutely correct.
Yeah, mine too. In fact, I had just resigned from DanceSafe, and I was living in Savannah, Georgia, and I got woken up by my friend, "Happy birthday, Manuel," because 9/11 is my birthday. Terrorists have just flown planes into the World Trade Center. We didn't have a TV. I turned the radio on just as the South Tower was collapsing. My head was spinning, and I realized, holy shit, my birthday is going to be used to promote war. We are going to war. I didn't really know where, but I knew that was happening. I was so pissed off. I got online. The first thing I did after finding it on 9/11, I got online and registered as many domain names for my birthday, like September11th.com, 911.org, et cetera, et cetera. I got 20 of them in my cart, and by the time I clicked, pay, 13 out of those 20 had been purchased by other people just before me for whatever reasons they were doing it. But I got 7 high-profile 9/11 domain names, and back then domain names were more, I know you're kind of obsessed. You buy tons of domain names too.
I buy way too many domain names.
I thought these would be really important. Then I go and watch TV, and I realize, oh my God, thousands of people died. I've got to do something responsible with these websites. So a couple months later, this organization of family members formed who didn't want their loved ones' deaths being used to promote war. They were called Peaceful Tomorrows, and I pointed all my domain names to them. That's
what nice. I did. Yeah, that's great. So I think the other dynamic is that the anti-drug education, which had not changed since the 70s, right? Just say no, dare, marijuana will induce schizophrenia, LSD makes you crazy and mutates your chromosomes, all of these stories. The generation just after mine was the first story that, like, as soon as they get told something, they go search it, right? They go look on the internet.
Yep.
And so the anti-drug education, the scare education, I don't even want to call it education, the anti-drug propaganda that had been used effectively for a long time really collapsed with the people who were born between like 85 and 95.
Right.
Like, it just totally collapsed.
Right.
Because as soon as you go search, marijuana, schizophrenia, like, there's just like mountains of data that disproves that. And so I think those kids really, really, really turned away from that anti-drug propaganda.
Oh, everything changed with the internet around the drug scene. Everything changed.
Right. And so I think that was the other dynamic, other than 9/11, was that this is a generation that, like, as soon as they go Google MDMA holes in the brain, I mean, that study was retracted almost immediately. So
this is going to be actually a large section in my movie. I'm going to talk about sort of the early history of DanceSafe. And you would be so interested in this. Maybe we talked about it before, but the government launched in 1999 what I call the last great anti-drug government-funded propaganda campaign. Because this was on the heels of the sort of Gary Webb revelations of how the DEA facilitated crack cocaine, et cetera. And they wanted to kind of rejuvenate their image. So they sent out press releases to, like, all of
You're talking about the youth anti-drug campaign they did.
No, this is 1999. This was the anti-club drugs, anti-ecstasy, really, media campaign that DanceSafe got itself injected into because 60 Minutes called me wanting to get footage of the drug. And I thought they told me they wanted to do a story on DanceSafe. I was like, wow, okay. I called Rick and find out what's going on. Oh, this is part of a DEA campaign. The DEA wanted to raise millions of dollars to open up what they call demand reduction centers around the country. And they did. And they're still around right now. And they used this new demon drug, which is destroying brain cells of kids, called ecstasy, is everywhere. And we need to crack down on it, right? So they send out all these press releases, and they really wanted to target raves. They needed to get into raves, they needed to shut them down. They were going to use the crack house laws to do it. And of course, no promoter would allow any media in. And so then 60 Minutes sees our website and says, oh, here's this group. They test drugs. And so they call me, and I wasn't going to do it at first, but Rick actually encouraged me, even because I thought they were going to do a hit piece against us, right? And he's like, even bad press for harm reduction is good press. So do the interview.
It's such a Rick attitude.
Yeah. And I'm glad I did, because the producer, they came out to visit me. They fly out a few times. They see the office. And then the third time, the talking head flies out, right, with the whole film crew, and they powder me up. And I was really nervous about it. And the producer whispers in my ear. She sees that I'm nervous and she says, "Don't be nervous. I've done ecstasy and I think what you're doing is great." and so I do the interview and they ask this Vicky Mabry, I don't know if she's still around, but she was the talking head. And she just asked me like 15 different times, "Aren't you just promoting drug use? What do you say to parents who think you're promoting drug use?" And I had learned this principle of PR, which is never repeat your opponent's argument even to deny it. So if I would have said, "We're not promoting drug use," boom, that's what they would have shown. It would have shown me denying. So I ignored every single question and I said, "The drug war kills children. We're saving lives. And where are those parents? We have parents that support us." And this was the first 60 Minutes at the time in 1999. It was the first TV news magazine that kind of broke the story, right? It was a 12-minute demon drug story on ecstasy, all this bullshit, everything you'd imagine. But right in the middle of it, there were 3 minutes about this nonprofit DanceSafe, and they did us justice. And after that, my phone never stopped ringing.
Right.
And I was on CNN, 2020, Geraldo, Jim Lehrer Hour, etc., Time, Newsweek. I was on Bob and Doug radio shows across the country. So we rained on their parade. But here's the thing about going back. Like, the reason is because the internet had come out about 5 years earlier. And they didn't realize that they no longer had the news information monopoly. They could get away in the past with just putting out whatever bullshit they want about drugs, and everyone would believe it because there was nowhere else to get information. But now no one believed it. And that's why I call this the last great government-funded anti-drug propaganda campaign, because they've never tried to do it again. Because the information is free. It's out there now.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, I forget who the quote is from. I think it might even be a John Perry Barlow quote. But yeah, the internet treats censorship as damage and routes around it.
Yeah.
That's literally how the internet treats censorship, is like, oh, it's a damage in the network, and it just like moves the data around the censorship. And so like you can't really censor the internet in like a functional way.
You know, thinking about this now, I'm realizing though, in politics, the truth has not risen to the top. There's so much fake news. Everyone's trying to influence things, and they don't care if they bend the truth or lie to do it, even like regular people. But in drugs, you don't really see that. People who talk about drugs on the internet, young people doing it, they really do try to get to the truth. So it's like the truth really does rise to the top, and the influencers are actually educating people correctly, right? We have DanceSafe, we have Blue Light, we have Drugs Forum, we have Psychonaut Wiki, Arrowit, of course. All these sites, for the most part, are not filled with nonsense.
Yeah, it's actually been like a really, really positive side of the internet. I think there are definitely like ups and downs to the internet, and also, you know, with the advent of the dark web now, we've actually seen this like massive change in the actual markets themselves, right? I mean,
oh my God, that's a whole story we could talk for an hour about.
Yeah.
But let's not do that because we have limited time, and this is really great, but we totally got off my outline, so I kind of want to go back. So I was gonna say, after the thumbprint story, is like ask you, okay, do you think that qualifies you to be a DanceSafe executive director? As a joke.
Yeah. I mean, I think that experience, one of the things I gained from that experience is a tremendous trust in my ability to handle my shit no matter how badly things go. You know, like I definitely learned to sort of surf the wave, right?
Right.
And if you try to control a situation like that, if you try to like maintain your set beliefs and set thoughts like during an experience like that, it can definitely go very sideways.
Don't try to maintain control.
Right, that all control is an illusion.
Yeah.
Right. I mean I think that's actually probably one of the core lessons of the psychedelic experience, is that any illusion you have of control is just that. It's an illusion. There is no real control in life, and so it's good to have that lesson hammered home when you're relatively young. And also that experience really, in a lot of ways, I think helped me personally understand the sort of intrinsic safety of classical psychedelics. Things like LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, they're just so incredibly physiologically non-problematic.
Right.
My personal motivation around this is that, or part of my personal motivation around why I love DanceSafe and why I love harm reduction so much, is that you really can teach people how to use these things in a way that statistically is going to be very, very safe. You know, there's always risks to substance use, but the more you learn about these substances, the more you learn how to use them, you really can start moving from the idea of harm reduction into benefit maximization, right? You can learn how to like gain things out of these substances, and there's things to be gained.
That's the best harm reduction there is.
Right. And we are not talking about with the drugs that are popular within these communities that we're servicing. These are not people who are experiencing any of the like DSM criteria for addiction. These are not people who are generally experiencing like chaotic substance use. These are people who are looking at the drugs and making a rational cost-benefit analysis. They believe that they are going to gain more from the experience than it will ever cost them.
I still do. In fact, the older I get.
Right. I mean, that's the thing, right? Is that often, or not even often, usually they're correct in that analysis. And I think that we really do a disservice both to the users and to the substances when we there's so many people within harm reduction who don't want to talk that way. Right? We don't want to glamorize drugs. And it's like, I'm not trying to glamorize them, but you can't lie about these substances.
Well, so I understand that when dealing with problematic drug use, I get why they're more like that. But what I don't understand is why so many other sort of DanceSafe equivalent organizations in other countries self-censor that way. Like, are we unique? I don't think we're unique, but we're probably
we're outliers.
We're outliers, and we're the top of the top in acknowledging the benefits. And I'm really happy, actually, that DanceSafe remained that way, because that's how I wanted it to be. And I think it really goes back to the fact that I was not a public health professional. I was an activist when I started DanceSafe, and I also knew how to allow the volunteers to shape the organization the way that they wanted to. So
yeah, and we're still very much that way, right? We're still very much a bottom-up, volunteer-run organization. And that's how it has to be, right? Because I'll never understand the intricacies of like the New York scene, the LA scene, New Mexico. I'll never understand these local communities as well as a volunteer living in those communities will understand them.
Right.
And so it has to be local. If you try to come in from national and, say, oh, we have to do X, Y, and Z this way, and it doesn't work in a given area, our volunteers are generally like, we self-select for people who are willing to bend the rules, right?
Uh-huh.
Like if you're not willing to be a little risky and to bend the rules, it's really hard to run a DanceSafe chapter.
Right.
And so telling people to do things that aren't going to work, our volunteers are generally just going to ignore you. And so
what is happening with DanceSafe these days? Because listeners might not know, I still work for DanceSafe behind the scenes, but I just kind of like do website shopping cart stuff, and I mail out the fentanyl strips, and occasionally, I'll go to a festival and staff a booth, but like I'm not involved in the National Office anymore. Like, what can you tell me? What's happening with DanceSafe? How many chapters we have? How many festivals we going to? What's newest and coolest thing going on right now?
Yeah, so roughly 26 active chapters. We have a bunch that are sort of getting ready to launch. We're obviously heading into sort of the off season right now. And so this is the time of year when we actually have the time to like really focus on organizational development, because during the summers, it's just like back to back of figuring out like what the next event is, what supplies need to go out, organizing these events. Although the downtime has actually sort of shrunk over the years. It used to be that Burning Man was sort of like the end of our like functional season, and then it didn't start again until like March, April, May.
Uh-huh.
Now it's really like October is when it ends. We have Halloween, which is a major event. It's 25,000 people or something.
I was just there.
Yeah. And so I guess the biggest things that are going on, the two sort of big things that we can talk about publicly is that so we've been borrowing an FTIR for a while from a group that we can't name. And so we've had an FTIR, which is a sort of really advanced piece of testing technology at quite a few events this year. But
this is infrared spectroscopy, or the Bruker Alpha machine that I got a chance to use at Halloween.
Yeah. And so we have been using that machine, but we haven't owned one. It definitely looks like we're going to be purchasing one pretty soon. We're actually going to be doing a public fundraising campaign around that by the time this episode airs, I suspect will be live. And the other major thing is that for longer than I've been involved in DanceSafe, there's been sort of very quiet DanceSafe involvement at Burning Man. Burning Man is one of the very few events that actually has a line they can point to in their permit about why they can't allow DanceSafe to operate openly. The permit that they get for the BLM closure order, which allows them to like use federal land but put a fence around it. So basically that's not public land for the few weeks that around Burning Man. The BLM closure order copies Nevada paraphernalia laws. So we're going to try to change Nevada paraphernalia laws.
Well, this brings up, like, you're in Denver, and weren't you part of Colorado changing its paraphernalia laws recently?
Yeah, I mean, I was the reason that happened.
That's great.
It was my first ever, like, actual lobbying that I've done, where I sort of looked at where the law needed to be changed with Maddie, who is the chief legal and financial officer. So she has a law degree, she has the background. So we figured out what language specifically we needed to change in the Colorado laws to make test kits completely legal to buy, sell, possess, everything. So not involving testing, but in terms of other harm reduction services at Burning Man, DanceSafe has now gotten a relatively large art car frame. So it's a frame that used to be a vehicle called Bertha, which was the big puffy yellow camp art car. We are building it in conjunction with an art group here in Denver called Gamma Space. We're building it out into a Hong Kong junk ship. So it's sort of I don't know if you guys know what a junk ship looks like. It's like a sort of squarish pirate ship. And it's going to be built around 3 55-gallon water tanks for doing sunrise water delivery to the big sound cars, giving out other harm reduction supplies, drug education. It's going to be the first mobile harm reduction outreach vehicle.
Are you having an orgasm?
I mean, I'm just so happy. Like, you have no idea.
Mitchell, you're the biggest burner I know.
Delivery art car since 2008. That was actually an idea I had at Burning Man in 2008. This was before my involvement with DanceSafe. But it was just like by sunrise at those big sound cars, you just physically can't carry enough water to still have water when the sun comes up. And now you're like, maybe 2 miles away from your camp.
DanceSafe at Burning Man.
Yeah, in like a big way, like a big way. Actually 3 things. So that we're buying a Bruker Alpha, we're doing the art car, and we also just got a grant from the Drug Policy Alliance to do the sort of back end work on creating a 50-state plan to remove paraphernalia laws in all 50 states.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Is that our first ever DPA grant?
Second.
Oh, okay. Because, they denied me in the early years 2 times in a row. I was like, fuck that. We're going to make our own money.
Yeah, no, they've become more supportive of drug checking.
Yeah, they hired Stephanie. They hired a nightlife harm reduction coordinator.
Harm reduction person. And, I mean, I think part of it is that they were convinced, not they. I mean, I think specific people at DPA were convinced that as soon as you set up drug checking, the DEA was going to come in and arrest everyone who came into the booth.
I wanted to find a lawyer before I went out doing it, and I approached DPA's lawyer to see if he would represent me. And I forget his name now, but he not only tried to talk me out of it, he tried to shame me that I was putting drug users at risk of arrest and I shouldn't do this. And I went and I found a local needle exchange attorney in San Francisco to represent me. So, they were afraid. I think wrongly. You have to push the envelope if you want to make change. But it took them 15 years to finally come on board, and I'm really happy about it.
Right, no, they are. And they invite us to set up at their reform conference every year. And I'm speaking on a panel at the reform conference. But yeah, so they gave us this grant. We're going to have a few legal interns that we're going to be able to do some, grant funded internships. We're going to basically develop a 50-state plan looking at the laws in all 50 states, developing that same document that I took to Colorado, right? Here's the paragraph in the law you need to change. Here's the recommended language of how we need to change it.
That's great.
And looking at which politicians in each state might be amenable to that sort of project.
Great.
Developing a strategy guide, a 50-state strategy guide, because the things that are going to work in Texas are not the things that are going to work in Oregon.
Right.
And then once that 50-state guide is developed, anyone in any state where there's still this language that criminalizes test kits, anyone who wants to take this on in their own state is going to have this guide that they can pull from.
That's awesome.
And so, yeah, I think that, for so long, my motto has been like, if you have to break the law, don't get caught. But I think I actually like, if you have to break the law, change the law a little better. Maybe that's just me getting older, All
right. Speaking of pushing the envelope, though, here's something I wanted to bring up. What I want to say was, you are an influencer, Mitchell, and that new word, particularly for social media. You're a social media influencer. I see your posts all day long on Facebook. And one of the things I really wanted to ask you, because in a way it kind of drives me crazy, because trying to get a phone call with you is the most difficult thing in the world. You don't even answer texts the way you take days to do that. Like you tell me,
sometimes days, not always.
But you tell me I have phone calls scheduled from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. I can maybe give you 15 minutes. I'm like, so you tell me this. I'm like, oh wow, that's great. Mitchell's really doing the work. But given that, how the fuck can you make 100 Facebook posts a day?
Oh, I schedule them. Yeah, yeah.
You schedule your Facebook posts ahead of time.
Yeah, I use Buffer. I use there's different software stuff I use.
Okay.
I'm not making these posts live.
That explains a lot more.
Yeah, so I'll often schedule stuff like on a Sunday to post on, because posting on Sundays, it's a really weird dynamic. I've noticed stuff doesn't get as much traction when you post it on the weekend. If you post it when people are at their jobs, they're on Facebook. Right, on the weekends, they're ignoring their phones. When they're at their jobs, they're checking their Facebook more often.
You do this personally. I can see organizations, businesses, and nonprofits wanting to do that to increase sales and stuff. But you personally schedule your just
my personal posts. Yeah, for sure. And also, I've actually found that harm reduction memes, doing it as an actual fucking meme, just gets a million times more traction, right? And however you can get the information in front of someone's face, right? Because pushing this narrative that the harms we associate with drugs are actually harms created by prohibition is a really tough narrative for a lot of people to understand. It's really, really hard to understand that no, almost every problem that you associate with drug use is actually a problem directly created by drug prohibition. Not all, but 99%. But humor is a way that you can sort of slip that into the cultural zeitgeist in a way that spreads. And I've seen memes that I created posted by pages that I have no connection to. I don't know any idea who runs these things, major pages, right? 50, 70, 100,000 followers, and they get millions of views. No, I really do think that mimetic culture, McKenna was super into this, right? You have to say things that people are going to be talking about, right? I don't know if he believed in the stoned ape theory, but he didn't care if it was true because it's a really good story, right? So who cares if it's true? If it gets people talking about the benefits of psychedelics and how these things have been influential in our history, and every person raised in every culture thinks that their culture is just natural, right? But historically, drug prohibition is the aberration, not the norm. For the vast majority of human history, psychedelics were integrated into society. They were just a part of life. They were a thing that people did. I mean, we were drawing mushrooms on cave walls before we invented writing.
So you got to tell the stoned ape story now real quickly, because
McKenna basically believed that the evolutionary thing, the thing that drove our development into Homo sapiens sapiens, was early hominids eating psychedelic mushrooms and develop new neural connections. And also they really had this desire to try to explain that experience, which requires a different level of linguistic communication than fire, tiger, food.
But wait, now hold on. Did McKenna really talk about psilocybin building new neural connections?
I'm pretty sure he did. I might be a little crazy.
Because I was always skeptical about that claim until just a few years ago, when these new studies have come out that show that the classic hallucinogens actually cause new dendritic sprouting. And then I thought, holy fuck, the tribes that actually did these things may have had smarter, better brains than other tribes and were able to outcompete. And so maybe very well psilocybin did actually help us along in our evolution. But I didn't even think that until these new studies shown the neurogenesis.
Yeah, I've long suspected personally that psychedelics grew new neural connections, just because any unusual novel experience does, right? That's literally how memories form, is you develop new physical connections. The wetware drives the hardware. Our thoughts literally change the physical structure of our brains.
Right.
And so how could a psychedelic experience, which is so novel, right? I mean, it's novel with a capital N. I mean, it's something unlike any, trying to explain psychedelics to someone who's never done them is just, you're talking rainbows to the colorblind, or maybe even the blind. And so how could that not develop new neural connections?
Yeah, that's true.
And so I've long believed that, but it's really nice to have the peer review data now.
Yeah.
Particularly with drugs, if you can't back up what you're saying, people just dismiss you out of hand, right? Oh, this guy just loves tripping. It's I very rarely use psychedelics anymore. It's very hard for me to block off 8 hours of my time, or 15 hours or 2 days.
Well, you don't need to with DMT.
No, it's true, but I just don't really use psychedelics all that often currently in my life.
Well, okay, so this brings up something I really wanted to talk to you about on the air, because it's been a debate we've had for a long time. One of the things I have disagreed with you about, and that is, and you're going to have to really defend yourself here.
All right.
The DMT Elves, the beings that I met and talked to me, and so many other people have, are real, dude. They're real.
Yeah, so I'm not. Hold on 1 second. I'm going to take a swig of my coffee real quick, because I need to defend myself properly caffeinated. Hold on. So, real REAL, real, to me generally means things which can be studied and examined in consensus reality. So to me, that's generally what that has meant, right? A thing that is analyzable, studyable, whatever. Now, I'm not saying they're not real with a lowercase r.
Okay.
Clearly to the person who is experiencing these entities, this is as real, lowercase r, as anything else they experience, right?
That's what I was going to say. Maybe we end up agreeing on that, because they're as real as what you experience here. Just because it's happening under the influence of a drug doesn't make it less significant, meaningful in your life, etc., right?
Sure. And I'm fully fine with that. But whether these things exist outside of our neural architecture or not, I think is a question that I don't really know how to examine.
All right. So this goes back to the ancient Vedanta and always gets back into this very same debate between us, and it does have to do with sort of the definition of real. Because in the West, something that's real is something that occupies a position in space and time. The table is real because there it is and I can bump into it. And then what is unreal is, they call it a hallucination. Oh, it was just in your mind or something like that. Whereas in the East, in Eastern philosophy, the definition of real is that which has always existed. Anything that has a beginning and an end and only exists in the middle, didn't exist at one point, won't exist again in the end. How can that be real? That's ephemeral. And so in the East, the only thing that is real is consciousness, Brahman, the one existence that projects infinite universes. And so when I go to these DMT spaces, they really strongly feel to me like these are other universes being projected by consciousness that you can sort of tap into. And so they are equally as unreal, right? Because the only thing real is Brahman.
Right, and you're fundamentally a non-dualist, right? I mean, you're basically a non-dualistic Advaidantic philosopher, for lack of an English term for what.
Since I was a teenager, in fact, yes.
Right. And so, I just really wish that if these things existed, they clearly possess a pretty tremendous technology, right? Technology with the thing looks like a damn machine, right? I mean, it doesn't look like a cave. It doesn't. People often say crystal cave. Maybe that's just because we're raised in like a Western technocratic society. Maybe it didn't look like a machine to somebody doing DMT 1,000 years ago.
No, I agree. You go to South America, do ayahuasca, it's all kind of jungle imagery. I think we
sort of. If you look at the paintings of Pablo Amaringo, I mean, a lot of his paintings have like what I would recognize as like technological elements. And that was before he was like really introduced to the sort of Western ideas of technology. He was, he's a traditionally trained ayahuascaro, and a lot of them do actually look technological. But if it's a shared space, and people on ayahuasca, I mean, I hate the term shared hallucination, but they share experiences pretty often, right? I mean, it's a pretty common dynamic to have shared experiences. The guy starts singing the Icaro for a jaguar. You don't speak any of the language, but the jaguar walks in the room, right? And so if it's a shared space, then somebody doing ayahuasca from a technological society might sort of pollute the space. They might bring that technological imagery with them into the place, and then Amaringo would see it. But I think that... I don't know. It just looks like a technology to me, and I just wish these guys would give us something useful. Like, give us faster than light travel. Give us better data. Like, give us something. But also, maybe I'm like a 3-year-old begging daddy for a handgun, right? Like, maybe that's why they don't give us anything useful. Is because like we're fucking children. Like, give us the guns.
You're presuming that they can give us things on our level of reality. What they usually give us is information so that we can transcend this physical reality.
But you're here. You're not there. What do you mean transcend? You're right here.
So the one thing about these beings that you meet, right, and you have to agree with this, is that like we know nothing about them, but they know everything or a lot about us.
It certainly feels that way.
Yeah. So if they're in a space where they have their own reality and yet they can also see us, they're on a higher level just because of the hierarchy. They have transcended this material world, but yet can still access it. And so why would they're going to give us guns? They're going to give us material technology, right? They're going to try to help us to move along to meet them again sometime, right?
Oh, it's a lovely story. I don't know if it's true though, but it's a really lovely story. Have you read either Supernatural by Graham Hancock or DMT Dialogues by Luke?
I have not.
So both really interesting books. DMT Dialogues is a little. It's really just like sort of shared thematic stories of the DMT experience. and a really, really sort of analytical examination of those shared experiences, which I find really interesting. I've actually spoken personally to several people who intentionally did DMT without reading any DMT trip reports or talking to people in detail about their experiences. They wanted to go in with like a sort of very clean, no cultural influences, including people who were like quite young when they did it, had really never heard anything about it other than like, it makes you see things, and they tried it and had these sort of very typical of light, the beings, the crystal cave, like the machines.
Mm-hmm.
I find that really fascinating because a Tea Fairy made this comment to me recently. The least interesting explanation for DMT that meets all of the data to date, that answers all the questions to date, is that all of us share a thematically identical alien Rembrandt in our visual cortexes that can be activated by this drug. That's the least interesting explanation that answers all of the data.
I mean, does this influence your belief for speculation that we may be a simulation of an alien technology and more advanced than this?
Oh, so man, there's a lot of words in there that I need definition. I think that the idea that what we experience is base reality, that it's like the ultimate lowest, this is like what's actually going on through our like monkey eyes and monkey brains. The idea that we are actually experiencing reality with all capital letters, like really, really the bottom line of reality, I think is very unlikely. Simulation implies something that I think,
well, it comes from kind of AI work where, we can create these conscious beings, but they're just in a artificial world that we've created. And that's led some people to speculate that, maybe we are these artificial creations in some super technological world.
But that is one that's a metaphor that is entirely unique to this moment in time and space.
No one else ever thought of that until Terminator 30 years ago.
Right. And the metaphor in the East before that was Maya, right? It was the dream of Brahman is like what this was. It was a dream, right? It was which also implies a level of unreality.
It implies a level of unreality, but it actually answers it in a more full way, I think, because in saying that all that exists is this one consciousness that projects an infinite number of things and that we are only able to experience a small slice of infinity, it just goes on forever. That kind of sums everything up. To say that we are a simulation of a race that is more technologically advanced than us begs the question of whether that race is only also a simulation of an even higher
just kicks the can down the road for sure.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, Russian nesting dolls of AIs.
And
right?
I thought it was people that can't get over their materialism. They still think that matter is real, not consciousness, and so they have to imagine some kind of material world that's real when nothing is real.
Yeah, I think that's more likely. Maybe it's both, right? Maybe the ultimate reality is pure consciousness, and then there's a lower reality that's what we would call a material alien technology that developed an AI that we're in. This doesn't have to be an either or, right?
People join DanceSafe, and you get to have these discussions all the time.
Yeah, I can come volunteer at events, and I'll be there ranting about aliens all the time. But I recommend you read Supernatural. I don't agree with everything in the book, but some of the things that he has discovered, some of the things that he has started to realize, the thematic similarities between the DMT experience, alien abductions, what we used to call fairy stories, like stories about fairy abductions, the jinn in Arabian cultures, the Ghanas in the Far East. There does seem to be like an underlying thing. There seems to be an experience that people experience that we can induce through DMT. And your interpretation of that experience is very culturally driven. Right? So a person who had this experience without the drug DMT, who lived in, Ireland in the 1500s, would interpret it as like a fairyland, right? I was taken to fairyland.
Right.
And there were these little beings and they had magic wands and time passed differently, right? I mean, the idea of time passing differently is like a prototypical DMT experience, right? I mean, it can be forever and ever, like forever is like,
but these stories are actually in the ancient Vedantic literature. Stories of a lifetime going by and then you wake up and you're only 5 minutes later. They actually have those stories written. This is like 2,000 years ago when these stories were written.
Right, and the easy answer is that some people experience endogenous releases of DMT, right? Some people's brains just like produce massive amounts of DMT. But to me, that doesn't answer anything. That just moves the question another stage down, right? Like, why would DMT do this? Why would that drug so reliably induce this like experience that when you strip away its cultural context, when you strip away the idea like, I was pulled into this tunnel of light in a UFO, and then there were aliens. It's like, okay, fine. But you remove the technological cultural context of that, and like the tunnel of light, the little beings, the messages. When you remove the technological cultural context, this is an identical story to shamanic initiations, to Vedantic literature, to fairy stories, to the, I mean, it seems to be a universal human experience. Some people have this experience without the drug, but we've now found a technology that can reliably induce that experience in just about anyone, right? If you read the Strassman study, pretty much everyone who was given a sufficient dose of DMT had that experience. And man, is that just really strange.
Crazy! Yeah, unbelievable. Though I've never heard a story of anyone smoking DMT and being taken up into a spaceship and given an anal probe.
I know somebody who, on DMT, was tied to a rock altar.
And given an anal probe?
The beings were removing their organs.
Oh, God.
Taking their organs out, examining them, and then putting them back in.
Well, that's a very culturally sci-fi context of our culture.
But it's also traditional Siberian shamanic initiation.
Oh, it is?
Is the idea that spirits would remove your organs and replace them with magical crystals. They would put a stone where your heart used to be. Right?
Interesting.
This is a very traditional shamanic initiation, is having your organs removed. I believe Australian Dreamtime stuff, there was that idea that your crystals were being put into you where your organs used to be. Siberian, South American. So like we seem to be seeing like a thing that so either the aliens have been doing this forever, right? And that's how people experience it. It's endogenous DMT releases, or there's a third option, which is that there is something that happens. We can induce it with DMT. It happens to people without DMT. And that thing that happens, it's so wholly other, right? It's so far away from anything you experience in consensus reality that your brain just imposes these cultural lenses over the experience.
Maybe there's some kind of collective evolutionary memory. Like, maybe we did fucking cut people open and pull their organs out.
Well, I mean, we find human bones that were clearly in cooking pots all the time, so...
That's true, yeah. In times of famine, which enhances evolutionary pressure, those who were willing to eat humans may have survived, and there's some element of collective memory around this. We know, like, for example, there's some element of being afraid of snakes that scientists think is sort of inborn.
Yeah, all of these explanations are just like... None of them really comport with my understanding of like how our brains should work, right? Like all of them require some sort of weirdness that has not yet been discovered. And I think that to me, the reason that psychedelics are so important, and I really do believe that they're important, is that the grand mystery is like how consciousness works, right? I mean, that's the grand mystery, is like how do certain complex arrangements of matter either become sentient or channel sentience, however you want to think of it.
Reflect sentience. They reflect sentience.
Yeah. But psychedelics are the microscope, right? I mean, they're literally the equivalent of the microscope. And because psychedelic research was outlawed in the 60s and is just now really starting again, think about what a computer looked like in the 60s. Think about what an airplane looked like in the 60s. Think about what, any of sort of technology looked like 50 years ago. And that is how behind we are in our study of psychedelics and human consciousness. We're 50 years off where we should be because of this dark ages, literally a dark ages, right? Knowledge was forbidden.
Right.
That's literally what a dark ages means, is that a certain field of knowledge was forbidden by the powers in charge.
Thanks, Nixon.
Right. So thanks, Nixon. And also like every president since, right? I mean, it's not like Obama came in and ended the drug war.
Right.
So thank them all. But we're finally starting to see cracks in the dike of this just fundamentally unconstitutional, human rights violating project of prohibition. I firmly believe that human beings are individual sovereigns. We own our minds, we own our bodies, and either we own them or we don't, and that the drug war has been a fundamental violation of that civil right. I think this is a civil rights fight. It has to be framed that way. It has to be talked about that way. And I actually think it connects really well with two other big fights. One is the right to reproductive health, right? If you don't have the right to your own bodies, and your own minds, then it's hard to argue for a right for abortion. And so I think it really connects very deeply with the reproductive health fight. The reproductive health people have had very little interest in joining us on this fight, but I hope they will. But the other fight that I think it really needs to connect to is the right for biological and cognitive enhancement that's coming with like all of these transhumanist technologies. Because if you think the government is going to let you upgrade your visual cortex when they won't even let you smoke weed, right? Like, you're just crazy if you think they're going to let you augment your consciousness if they don't even let you get high. And so we have to establish cognitive liberty as a civil right before these technologies become available.
So interesting. And that's part of the cognitive liberty argument, which is sort of the other side of the harm reduction argument to end prohibition. And this might be a good segue to get back to that and close this out with more harm reduction discussion, because one thing that I wanted to talk with you about is how the scene has changed and how it changes so rapidly, because 2013, 14, 15, we had between 20 and 30 deaths a year. And over the last few years now, we're hardly seeing any. And I'm wondering, what do you think? Because I got some ideas, but I want to hear from you first. What do you think the reason is that things have gotten better in the last few years?
Yeah, I think part of it is the sort of widespread acceptance of test kits. I really do believe that. I personally spend a lot of time when I'm at festivals just walking campgrounds, talking to people. I think it's a really great way to sort of get a read on like what's happening within a community. And you really do see now people walking around campgrounds trying to sell substances. Like, people pull out test kits before they buy those substances. Like, it's a totally normal thing that even just 5-6 years ago was not as common as it is now. But also part of it is that we had a couple years there where the misrepresentations that were happening were particularly dangerous, right? So we had 2,5-IN bomb being sold as LSD. We had, a lot of the sort of exotic cathinones, alpha PVP hitting the market, and ethylpentalone. We're still seeing some of the issues with the cathinones, but the 2,5-IN bomb has basically disappeared. You can't really find N bomb anymore. And part of that is that we got a lot of like sort of major press over the last couple of years, right? I mean, we were in Rolling Stone, we were in Playboy, we were
Teen Vogue.
Teen Vogue did a great cover. I mean, it was amazing. Like Family Circle, right? Like, how in the world am I being quoted in Family Circle? I mean, it's just totally bizarre. It's like it's like being asked to like go speak at like Liberty University or something, right? I mean, it's like just totally bizarre to me. And I think that part of the reason that the festival scene has gotten so much safer is actually the fentanyl crisis. The fentanyl crisis has raised the visibility of misrepresentation in a way that no nonprofit ever could have done. Like, you could never have gotten as much press around misrepresented drugs as you get when somebody like Prince dies because of fentanyl. Right? When somebody like Tom Petty, right? Like, it's just these major if somebody like Tom Petty's drugs can be misrepresented, like, what chance does a person at a festival have, right? Like, he has better connects than you, like, period. Right?
Not just to mention, there's 50,000 people dying most likely from fentanyl out of the 70,000 deaths a year. Well, but they're not all fentanyl. I think 50 might be fentanyl. That's a humongous number of people. And so, like, everyone knows someone who knows someone who's died from fentanyl. Everyone knows someone who knows someone who's died from fentanyl.
Right. And when people hear about that, that's it. And so I think that's a big part of it, is that people have gotten really cautious about testing their substances because they know that, like, if Prince and Mac Miller are getting sold misrepresented drugs, you probably are too. It's a really, really, really shitty dynamic, right? Like, we should be able to push health messaging without deaths. But the sad reality is this is often how social progress happens, right? Is around tragedy. But the conversation around testing has gotten really robust. What has not happened, which I think is really a missed opportunity on the part of particularly the libertarian right and the sort of cognitive liberty left, is that we have not seen a major conversation around the fact that every one of these fentanyl deaths is directly attributed to heroin prohibition.
That's probably true. Yep, there wouldn't be fentanyl around if heroin were legally available, even in the form of widespread heroin maintenance programs. Like even
if it was just heroin maintenance programs. Even if it was just medical treatment facilities that provided maintenance doses of heroin. And so we have not had that conversation.
So you're going to DPA. Are you going to bring it up? Are people talking about this within the reform movement?
Yeah. Within the reform community, it's a relatively common conversation. It's not what I'm speaking about there. My panel there is a different panel. It's actually probably the most controversial panel I've ever spoken on at a conference. It's engaging drug sellers in harm reduction is the title. So we're talking about how we can get people who are selling substances actively involved as harm reductionists.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I don't want to have this conversation at reform conferences. I want to see this conversation happening on, presidential debate stages, on CNN, because we have now passed the point in terms of number of deaths. The fentanyl crisis has now passed HIV at its peak. It has now passed car accidents at their peak. It has now passed gun deaths at their peak. Like, when HIV was killing this many people, we had a massive national response to this crisis, right, that really addressed the root of the issue. We need broad education around the problems. We need to make sure condoms are available everywhere. We need to put billions of dollars into researching immunosupporting drugs. And for this crisis, there's actually a relatively easy answer, right? We already have all of the pieces we need to end the fentanyl crisis tomorrow. We can end it tomorrow.
Well, there's one difference, And that is that we stigmatize people who use drugs, whereas HIV was starting to spread through sexual contact into the non-gay community. And I think that's eventually when people started accepting needle exchange.
Yeah, which is really a shame, but I do understand that. But also, we've now passed the point where more than 50% of Americans have tried an illegal drug at some point in their life, right? So most people
if you subtract cannabis out of that, it's a lot less.
Okay, that's fine.
I don't think it's... I think among like millennials, like MDMA is number 2, which is about 30%. And then think below that, you dip way down below 10, maybe even 5% of people have tried LSD.
All of those numbers are generated by phone surveys.
You're right. Or they go into classrooms. We really don't know. Right. Yeah, we really don't know. Mm-hmm.
When they say that 30% of millennials have tried MDMA ever in their life, I just laugh. Like, I know that age group. I know that age bracket really well.
You think it's more?
I think it's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 80.
Great. The world's getting better.
One can hope. Uh-huh. But yeah, I think that ending the stigma is one thing, but we really, we're not even having the conversation about the data. I really hate that we're not having this national conversation around drug prohibition at the time when it seems like this would be the time to have it. Although I also think that we're not in the middle of an opioid crisis. I think we're at the beginning of one. There are so many fentanyl analogs that are so much more potent than fentanyl. Yep. If they do manage to build a wall along the southern border and start searching mail a little more robustly, people are just going to switch from fentanyl to carfentanil to acetafentanil to 4-fluorobutafentanil. They're just going to keep switching to more potent analogs in an attempt to circumvent anti-smuggling efforts. And some of these drugs have 100,000 doses to the gram. And you cannot stop a gram of powder from getting in federal prisons, let alone a country. It's where we're at. And it's just so easy to fix it. It's just so easy to end this crisis once the political will is there.
Right. I'm glad you're doing it, Mitchell. I'm glad you've taken up the torch. Yeah, this is a great place to close. You are such an eloquent speaker and a great representative for this movement. Again, I'll end like I opened. I'm so happy you're the executive director. I'm glad you're out there speaking in the media. I want to do more podcasts with you. I'm sure our audience is going to love this one. So thank you so much for being on the show and for what you do.
Oh, thanks, E-Man. I super appreciate it. And thank you for starting an organization that not only literally saved my life when I was younger, but also that I now get to sort of be the first follower of and help sort of guide the movement, because it's really not an idea I think I ever would have had on my own to just go out and try to get arrested doing drug checking. But it's one that really resonates with my sort of underlying attitudes about the world. So I greatly appreciate
You're welcome. It changed my life, that's for sure.
Yeah, changed a lot of lives.
Thanks again.